The polling company Gallup said that it would stop tracking the president's approval rating for the first time in 88 years. Coincidentally, at the exact same time that Trump's approval rating is the lowest the organization has measured since the 1930s. Now, it's clear to see why Trump's approval rating is so low. Between ICE brutality, a disastrous tariffs plan that has only increased costs for American families, and an extremely disappointing jobs growth number coming out of last year. But covering up just how poorly Trump is doing is not going to sway anyone. News broke on Wednesday that Gallup, the polling company, says it will no longer measure presidential approval for the first time in nearly 9 decades. Now, a lot of people immediately asked, does this have something to do with the Trump administration putting pressure on the polling company? And a spokesperson for Gallup is sort of denying that. They're saying, oh, this reflects an evolution in how Gallup focuses its public research and thought leadership. And when pressed for more details by The Hill, the Gallup representative said this is a strategic shift solely focused on Gallup's research goals and priorities. But a lot of people aren't buying that. If you look at the Gallup polling data around Trump's approval rating, the numbers show a possible reason why his administration might not want this to be public data. You can see there's a steadily decreasing line here going from 47% approval rating down to 36% approval rating, which, according to The Hill, is actually among the lowest approval ratings that the organization has found since the poll began. It's certainly lower than President Joe Biden's approval rating, which was at an average of 42% between 2021 and 2025. And it's very far away from some of the highest approval ratings on record. Former President Kennedy experienced some of those with a 71% rating from January 1961 to November 1963. Trump's administration loves to harken back to the so-called good old days, but when it comes to what's happening on the ground for everyday Americans, there are a lot of reasons why Trump could never reach the same numbers as somebody like Kennedy could. And this isn't even the first time that something like this has happened with the Gallup poll. The new headlines are presenting this as something totally unprecedented. But Brandon Friedman on Blue Sky pointed out that something very similar actually happened during Trump's first term. He posted that if you saw today's headline that Gallup will stop measuring presidential approval, they did the same thing in 2018. They do it whenever Trump is president. So he linked back to this Politico article from 2018 with the headline, Gallup retreats from political polling again under new leadership. And it goes into detail to say that back during Trump's first term, Gallup switched its presidential tracking poll from a daily poll to a weekly poll. And then it announced that it would only measure his job approval rating on a monthly basis. Again, just like now, the company isn't saying that the Trump administration had anything to do with this. They're saying that this has to do with Gallup's overall strategic goals. But as Nico Perino, an executive for the free speech organization FIRE, noted on X, there could be another reason why Gallup is doing this. He wrote, when a recent Times Siena poll showed Trump's approval rating slipping, Trump said he was going to add the poll to his meritless defamation suit against the New York Times. He's sued other pollsters too. It's hard to believe this isn't connected to Trump's litigiousness, which is a threat to press freedom. Peter Baker at the New York Times added, this is a huge loss for journalists and others who follow politics. Gallup has been the top source for presidential approval since FDR, and particularly valuable because of that historical context with apples to apples numbers that allow us to make comparisons and see patterns. This is a classic maneuver for Trump and for his administration. If the numbers look bad and if sentiment on the ground is even worse, then don't fix that by making better changes that will benefit everyday Americans. Fix it by trying to cover it up. And if you can't cover it up, threaten and intimidate people into doing that work for you. In fact, Trump is using that mentality when it comes to some of his policies that have made him so unpopular in the first place. Mediaite reports that he flat out threatens Republicans if they jump ship from voting for his tariffs. This is based on a Truth Social post that Trump made right as 6 members of the House GOP joined 213 Democrats in narrowly passing a resolution to repeal his tariffs on Canada. So Trump took to Truth Social and he posted, any Republican in the House or the Senate that votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries. Our trade deficit has been reduced by 78%, the Dow Jones has just hit 50,000 and the S&P 7,000, all numbers that were considered impossible just 1 year ago. In addition, tariffs have given us great national security because the mere mention of the word has countries agreeing to our strongest wishes. Tariffs have given us economic and national security, and no Republican should be responsible for destroying this privilege. There are several things wrong with that statement. First of all, it goes to show that Trump's style of political leadership is not embracing the best ideas, but rather embracing threats and intimidation to get whatever he wants, including by publicly threatening and intimidating members of his own party, which is why so many of them fall in line. But some of these Republicans who disagree with him aren't even up for re-election this year, which gives them a rare opportunity to go against Trump's wishes and at least not have to suffer any political consequences because they're ditching the field entirely. Another thing that's wrong here is that Trump is citing numbers that have very little to do with what everyday Americans on the ground are actually experiencing in terms of economic outcomes and affordability. Tariffs may allow the federal government to increase its wealth, and as we all know, Trump profits handsomely from that. But tariffs don't help people on the ground. This report from the Tax Foundation found that the Trump tariffs amount to an average tax increase per US household of $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. So our costs are actually growing in response to these tariffs. The report goes on to say that the Trump tariffs are the largest US tax increase as a percent of the GDP since 1993. So again, that golden era the Trump administration loves to talk about, which only ever existed for the people at the very top, we're not getting back to that. Things are actually getting worse. And finally, when Trump talks about the tax cuts he's instituting, these tariffs essentially reverse that entirely. The report says we estimate that the tariffs raised 132 billion in net tax revenue in 2025. But the Trump tariffs threaten to offset much of the economic benefits of the new tax cuts while falling short of paying for them. And finally, historical evidence and recent studies show that tariffs are taxes that raise prices and reduce available quantities of goods and services for US businesses and consumers, resulting in lower income, reduced employment, and lower economic output. Lest we mention the fact that Trump doesn't have the unilateral authority to institute these tariffs that he claims he does. The judicial system just hasn't caught up with him as he's bulldozing through the Constitution and his legal responsibilities as president. And when it comes to the rationale for these tariffs and the specific numbers that Trump is putting out there, we know they're not coming from a place of logic or reason or research. In fact, a lot of these things are just numbers that Trump himself is arbitrarily deciding based on personal slights or things that have happened to him in phone calls. Here's Trump's rationale on why he wanted to raise tariffs on Switzerland by 9% instead of lowering them.
We weren't taking anything. I said, well, we have to do something because we have to even that up a little bit. I didn't have to get everything at one time. So I put on a 30% tariff, which is very low. Still, we were having a big deficit, but it was half the deficit. Then I got an emergency call from, I believe, the Prime Minister of Switzerland, and she was very aggressive, but nice, but very aggressive. Sir, we are a small country. We can't do this. We can't do this. I couldn't get her off the phone. We are a small country. I said, you may be a small country, but we have a $42 billion deficit with you. No, we are a small country. Again and again and again. I couldn't get her off the phone. So it was at 30%. And I didn't really like the way she talked to us. And so instead of giving her a reduction, I raised it to 39%. And then I got inundated by people from Switzerland. And I figured, you know what, we'll do something that's a little bit more palatable, at least now. But I realized that all these, Switzerland you think of as, ultra chic, ultra perfect, they're not. They're only that way because we allow them to.
Trump goes on to say that there are tons of other countries he could name, but he won't. Probably because he can't. You listen to the president talk about these things, and it's the logic of a child in preschool. He says he wanted to raise taxes on Switzerland because he didn't like the tone of voice that Switzerland's leader used in conversation with him. The president of the Swiss Confederation last year was a woman. So, this is who Trump was talking to on the phone, although you'll catch that he doesn't even quite remember if she was in charge of Switzerland or not because he has memory problems and often doesn't know what he's talking about. But nonetheless, he didn't like the tone that this woman took with him. He doesn't respect her as a foreign leader. And therefore, he tried to retaliate against her by raising tariffs that unilaterally hurt people in Switzerland and America. The only person who would benefit from this is Trump's ego, which is the main driver behind all of these financial decisions that are hurting everyone. And with that in mind, it's no surprise that the jobs data from the first year of Trump's second administration was significantly more dismal than even his own aides expected. The Daily Beast reported that job growth during Trump's first year back in office was far weaker than previously estimated. The projection is that there would be over 500,000 jobs added, roughly 50,000 jobs per month. But instead, the economy added fewer than 200,000 jobs last year for an average of just 15,000 jobs per month. That's the weakest year of job gains on record outside of a recession since 2003. And under former President Joe Biden, there were 168,000 jobs added per month on average. That means, according to the original estimate, Biden would have added nearly 4 times as many jobs per month than under Trump. But the actual numbers came in far shorter than those expectations. But you won't hear that on Trump's Truth Social account. He's saying great job numbers, far greater than expected, because of course he is. He's the emperor with no clothes. And even the people within Trump's administration, like Peter Navarro, his senior counsel for trade and manufacturing, are coming up with reasons that don't quite pass the smell test for why the jobs numbers are so bad. Navarro is claiming that Wall Street can't be too upset because the lower jobs numbers are because of the mass deportation campaign the Trump administration is currently conducting. That's absolutely brutal and inhuman reasoning that still doesn't explain the numbers and certainly doesn't equal a satisfactory explanation for all the Americans who are being hurt by this. And economics experts refer to these things as unsatisfactory explanations. The immigration policies have something to do with it, but so do the disastrous trade policies. And that still doesn't explain away all of the job losses in sectors like manufacturing, which Trump promised would be booming thanks to his new tariff policies. The opposite has occurred. And even members of Trump's own party are starting to ring the alarm bell around this. A member of his first administration, Nikki Haley, says that Americans need to feel some hope if Republicans want to have any chance in the midterms this year. What she said on Fox News paints a pretty dismal portrait.
Look at the polls now. You have the Fox poll, are you better off financially? Better, 24%, worse, 39%, same, 36%. There is some worry in Republican ranks, Karl Rove, others, about where things stand as you look across the country. Where do you see the election ahead of November?
Well, thank God we didn't get Kamala Harris. I'll say that all day long. But what I will say is there has not been enough focus on the affordability issue for Americans. You still have too many kids living at home. You still have people who can't deal with rent. You see people, they have less money in their wallets, and you can't look at the stock market and say the economy is doing well. We are looking at now $39 trillion in debt. Social Security is going to run out in over 6 years, leaving 75 million Americans having to make a choice. Something needs to be done. This is not, fiscal conservatism has not been talked about at all during this administration. And I think now is the time to focus on the value of a dollar, which is weakening, on how we get more money in Americans' pockets, how we increase jobs, which are flattening, and start to make American people feel like they can have hope. And that's the one thing I want Republicans to really fight for going into the midterms, because if Americans don't feel like there's some hope with their wallets and some hope in raising their families, we will lose.
Nikki Haley makes some points about why Americans are feeling this way, but I can't give her any credit because she opened up her statement by saying at least Kamala Harris isn't in the White House. The reality is, Republicans cannot just keep pointing fingers across the aisle and expect that to explain away all of their problems or make it make sense that Donald Trump is in the White House. Kamala Harris is not the problem here. The problem is Republicans have enabled and supported the rise of a tyrant who has no idea what he's doing or what he's talking about ever. The reasons why Trump's economic policies have been failures is because Trump doesn't know anything about economics and he doesn't rely on any experts to help him out. He just bases his decisions on his own egotistical whims. Nikki Haley, look in the mirror and ask yourself, why did you allow Trump to come back into office a second time? Why did you contribute to those efforts? The one thing that Nikki Haley really gets right here is that making the numbers go away isn't going to make anything any better. Putting the Gallup poll under an invisibility cloak isn't going to make Americans feel any better about the economy or about the Republican Party. We're well past the point of being able to cover up these terrible numbers and the reality they reflect on the ground. Republicans better hold tight for the midterms because it is not going their way.